Previously, on Less Symbolic Maturity 1, the left's learning problem. There's a spectre haunting the left, the spectre of thoughtlessness. Then surely must be ways to approach a field of study in such a way that the more you're taking part of that approach, the more difficult it is to progress and succeed in the upper levels of the hierarchy of learning.
And when the forest would grow rank and needed clearing for new growth, I was there to set it ablaze.
If I am going to challenge the entirety of the left, it should be the minimum of decency of providing some foundation on which I stand to attack it, should I not? Welcome to Lessons in Political Maturity 1, the left's learning problem, Chapter 1, Learning Itself, Subchapter 2, Basics in Political Literacy. In order to perform any type of learning and make any kind of conclusions, you need to accumulate knowledge. There are only two ways of doing it, and out of those two ways, there came the two types of knowledge that we can have. Those are analytic knowledge and synthetic knowledge. Analytic knowledge involves understanding that is derived from breaking down concepts or propositions into simpler components and examining their logical relationships. Here you look at and make conclusions out of the logical structures ideas have. Analytic knowledge has several implications. First is that when you start, you have all the information and properties of the system given as premises. You know all the dynamics involved from all participants. Analytical knowledge has its place in thought experiments without any necessary feedback from the real world. You can invent anything, and with the assumption given, you can see where that leads you. In politics, however, analytic knowledge has relatively little applicability. Politics involves action. It involves how the real world looks like, and how do you want to keep or change it. When making responses in politics, all you need to say to undermine an analytic knowledge-based example is to include some real structure, dynamic, or phenomenon which undermines the logical progression. That's where synthetic knowledge becomes very important. Synthetic knowledge involves understanding that is derived from empirical observation and experience, rather than just logical analysis. It synthesizes information from various sources to form a comprehensive view of reality. With synthetic knowledge, you need feedback to know what is going on and what do you need to change about your interpretations. Now, analytic and synthetic knowledge sometimes feel to me like they were named like Iceland and Greenland. Iceland has comparatively many natural habits, green and due to volcanoes ironically warm, full of hot springs, and Greenland is almost entirely an ice plateau. Why does the analytic synthetic knowledge give me this impression? Is because data analytics is a field which falls under synthetic knowledge. Synthetic also sounds like something was artificially created, when its foundation is experience rather than abstraction. Anyway, we need to talk about data analytics for a few moments. Data analytics is a major activity done in relation to news, to statistics, etc. To perform data analytics, you need three things. In increasing order of importance, they are the data, the model, and the frame. The weirdness of this subject keeps increasing because I just said that data is the least important part of data analytics. What are these data? They are observations, labeled input entries, parameters, anything collected from the real or sometimes simulated world as far as the synthetic system is concerned. Next, there is the model. The model is the primary computation tool of data analytics. Here is the process which puts the data into equations, it gathers, manipulates them, processes them, monitors what happens until getting the outputs of the system. Third, and most importantly, is the frame. The frame binds the whole system together. The frame is used to decide the truth of the whole system. With the frame, once you have your outcomes, they are evaluated to conclude if they are good outcomes, what interpretation the model output should be given, and many other things like which data are valid, what equations to include in the model, how solid and reliable the whole process is. The frame decides what is allowed and what isn't allowed to be a conclusion. Let me give you an example to see why a frame is important. But first, I need to explain a few more notions. A dependent variable is a variable whose value is given by a rule. An independent variable is a variable which does not rely on anything studied. So if there is a relation between the dependent and independent variable, we can measure what effect on the dependent variable does a change in the independent variable has. A confounding variable is a variable which is not being measured but causes changes both in the dependent and assumed independent variable. For example, if we have a graph comparing the daily quantity of ice cream consumed in a country versus the number of sunburns, and we can see that there is a clear correlation, does that mean that more ice cream causes sunburns, or that people eat more ice cream when they have sunburns? Because we have experience in this field, both you and me know that the answer is neither. They are both caused by high outdoor sun intensity, which causes a higher temperature, so the people want to eat cold things like ice cream, and the sun's rays having a higher flux. Higher flux means more solar energy, and more energy causes damage to the skins, thus the sunburns. The frame defines every axiom and every heuristic that governs both the model and the data. What is an effective model? What logic is appropriate for the analysis? What data do we include? What assumptions we have implicitly? What will make a model's answer useful? Each of these questions must be answered either explicitly or implicitly, or the analysis has an unreliable foundation. A commonly used term for when the frame fails to filter out bad assumptions, bad data, bad scope is garbage in, garbage out.
Shut the f*** up. Know your f***ing place, trash.
One of my favorite examples of this is when relying entirely on a model to answer a complicated question, you can reach the scenario. So, how did you reach your conclusions? Because the toaster says brrrr. Here's a few examples relating to politics.
Even subtle variations on the type of question can lead to massively differentiated results. Subsequently, without a way of understanding the purpose of the question at the moral and intuitive level, no meaningful decision can be made. A classic example may illustrate this point. Sometime in the mid-1970s, a study was performed at UC Berkeley, showing that women were significantly less likely to be admitted into the school's graduate departments, even though men and women applicants had roughly comparable resumes. Was this clear evidence of unfairness against women? Perhaps. However, after further analysis, when admissions rates were examined at the department level, the exact opposite conclusion was reached. For each department across the board, women's admission rates were identical or even higher than their male counterparts. So based on the same data set, women were being under-admitted at the university level, but over-admitted in each department that made up the university. How did this make any sense? What the researchers had stumbled upon was a frustrating obstacle in translating statistics into human language, specifically the Simpsons paradox, where an effect can appear strongly in aggregate and then completely disappear in all subdivisions. In the Berkeley case study, what happened was a mismatch in each department's admission standards, where the supply and demand of degrees and funding varied radically. Men disproportionately applied to departments with higher funding and graduate admission rates, for example engineering, and women disproportionately applied to departments with lower funding and fewer highly contested graduate positions, for example in the humanities. Under these circumstances, there was necessarily a larger number of female rejections, even when the individual departments preferred female applicants. So, the statistical mystery is solved, but how do these statistical measurements help us answer the original question of whether anything unfair was going on at the women's graduate admissions? All of the analysis has been given to us in two measurements, one microcosmic and one macrocosmic, each implying opposite conclusions. Which is the relevant quantity? Which is the signal and which is the noise? There is no formal or procedural way to answer this question from the data. It all depends on the frame we are using for the question. With a normal understanding of how graduate admissions work, and a classic Western understanding of fairness, the department-level measurement is the relevant statistic. Students are admitted via the individual department standards, so the lack of under-admission in each department would indicate no discrimination against females in the adjudication process. However, this conclusion is dependent on the moral assumption that fairness means a neutral standard of arbitration. From the perspective of equity, restorative justice, or crude feminism, a neutral standard would likely be irrelevant next to the existence of disparate outcomes, or the emotional trauma suffered by women due to their greater rates of rejection. The frame, not the data, decides the issue. I'm hoping that a certain amount of demystification may have occurred recently in the wake of a series of LLM fiascos, most prominently by Google's Gemini image creator, which, despite repeated requests to make images of European historical figures and citizens from predominantly European countries, just could not draw white people. What could cause advanced LLMs to do this? Was there some bug in the code? But it gets worse. Whatever assumptions about race equity and inclusion Google used to build their model also made the resulting text responses very open to genocidal sentiments, just as long as it was directed against the right white people. Google was ultimately forced to take notice of the problem when people requested pictures of mid-century Germans, and the predictable images of black SS officers Gemini produced were deemed offensive to the African American community. Perhaps the engineers needed to adjust some parameters. Maybe Google needs to recalibrate its model on more historical data. But really, this fiasco should trigger a larger conversation as we contemplate the reality that Google tried to design an LLM with ungodly amounts of computational power to accurately and humanely represent history, but instead produced a machine that couldn't do anything but create false, bigoted, and eliminationist portrayals of the past. And everyone watching this disaster unfold knows full well that these insane responses coming out of Google's Gemini didn't spring spontaneously from a GPU cycle or coincidentally emerge from a misaligned neural network parameter. They were intentionally built into the system's framework by a management team who intended for Gemini to act less as a tool to represent history than as a weapon to systematically misinform its customer base and push Google's preferred politics agenda. Hey, remember when Google's slogan was, "Don't be evil"? What happened to that? It sounds similar to another slogan from IBM in the 70s. A computer can never be held accountable. Therefore, a computer must never make a management decision.
In more practical terms, here's how a difference in frame applies to the process of politics and what comes into mind when doing a debate.
The sad reality is that the most effective way to mobilize your supporters is to take complex political situations and simplify them into Marvel-level narratives. That means that to win, you have to portray your opponents as villains who torture puppies in their spare time. After you demonize your opponents, you simply cannot sit down with them and have a heart-to-heart. You can also not really have any trust or goodwill with the people that you fucking dehumanize. As long as political parties fight for votes, they will demonize their enemies. And if you think that the ideology of your enemies is something extracted from pure black tar evil, then you should stay away and not even engage with their ideas under any circumstances. Finally, the occasions where political opponents do meet are not optimal for a conversation. Instead, they are optimal for having a debate. As an avid participant in my local debate team, I will tell you that although debating is fun, nobody has ever changed their minds because their opponents defeated them with fact and logic in a debate. When you are debating someone, you're having a verbal duel. Like a gladiator, you're looking for weaknesses and exploiting them. Any argument that you can strawman is a win. Any chance you get to go in to indirectly call them stupid or evil is a win. And of course, you should not expose your own weaknesses or concede a single point to your opponent. You are infallibly right and they are undoubtedly wrong. The whole point of a debate is to humiliate your opponent and win over the crowd. But in most cases, you get two idiots talking past each other, and their respective fans mindlessly cheering for their side. That is, of course, what Grandma really does not want to see at her dinner table, and why politics is also such an ugly business. Because the left cannot understand the right, libertarians cannot understand authoritarians, and the centrists cannot understand any of them. When we do not want to understand each other, we cannot have an honest conversation with each other, and then all that we have left is debate. So what is the main difference between a debate and a conversation? The difference lies in the goal. In a debate, your goal is to gain political power by humiliating your opponent. And in an honest conversation, the shared goal of both participants is to find the truth. That is what philosophy is, right? What is philosophy other than people sharing their ideas in the pursuit of truth? To have an honest conversation, you need to engage in philosophy. And when you have a debate, you will engage in sophistry. And so we realize that we have not really changed in the 2,400 years since Socrates was discussing with the sophists.
Another very important concept I want to be discussing is the concept of trends. When I will say that the left does something or talk about the attitudes and behavior of leftists, I'm describing a trend. It's a conclusion. As the hundreds of examples in this episode will show, I base this conclusion on what is consistent with the behaviors of leftists. I see leftists push for a cause in a certain way on one issue, then I see the same strategy and attitude on another issue. If this keeps repeating, I will conclude that that tactic is a trend in the left. This, in it of itself, would be sufficient ground for saying that something is the leftist way of doing things. But there is one more aspect which strengthens my analysis, and that is found in what they are missing. In any magic trick, at least half the magic is you paying attention to where the magician makes you focus on, so you can ignore what's not right in front of you. The same way, I know that what I describe is the leftist way of doing things because nothing that the left does by itself goes against it. From which we come to needing to understand what the left and the right are. I would like to inform you that officially, from now on, I will very rarely address these large level framing tools that I'm presenting until now in this chapter. You will need to see them again and remember them when I will make new examples which confirm my observations. Politics is most often divided between a left and a right, but what do these distinctions mean? What properly explains what position to expect on the right wing and what position to expect on the left? Some say it's big government versus small government, or collectivism versus individualism, or progress versus reaction. The best option I heard anyone say is egalitarianism versus hierarchy, but that's still not a good enough answer. It still doesn't explain why the right would have certain values and the left would have others. These are still conclusions, they are not orientations. Therefore, in order to properly understand politics, let's do an exercise. I'll give you a series of positions that someone might take in politics and I'll try to select the most obviously right-wing or left-wing ones. And then we can conclude with them what the political spectrum is about. The notions of left and right began in 1789 with the division in the French National Assembly at the time of the French Revolution. So let's start with the question asked there. Which one is on the left and which is on the right? Monarchy, democracy. Feminism, patriarchy. Xenophobia, xenophilia. Duty security, liberation. Majority bloodline, ethnic minorities. Diversity, ethnic homogeneity. Open borders, closed borders. Anarchy, leadership hierarchy. chastity and modesty, sexual libertinism. Glorify strength and overcoming difficulty, glorify weakness and disability. Support victims, stopping offense, victims becoming stronger and taking precautions. Religiousness based in virtue ethics, choosing religious beliefs, atheism. Revolution, security, restorative justice, punitive justice, heteronormativity, sexual minorities, heroes, hippies, anti-drugs, prohibition, pro-dogs, booze, bugmen or monks, growing up being a real man, or embracing childhood, cosmopolitanism, or nationalism. Okay, you have all of these laid down. As I said, equality versus hierarchy is overall the best single conclusion to base politics around, but it doesn't explain anything. Can being in favor of equality and flat hierarchies explain being pro-drugs and alcohol or sexual liberation? Not really. And even if it could, and the right would be about hierarchy, why is sexual liberation compared to chastity and not sexually serving the strong and sex slavery? This doesn't add up. There are gaps. Why would the right honor heroes in particular and not just superiors? Why would the left be strongly pro-disability in particular and call out working out as fascist, as you'll see later in the episode, rather than, yes, believing in equality but thinking everyone should get stronger regardless? Why would the left constantly highlight its victimization while the right would seek to outgrow it? I think I've asked enough questions. Take a minute to think about them and then tell me what orientation explains the left, what orientation explains the right. For my answer, the right wing has the values needed to survive and bring societies out of crisis. The left wing has the values dependent on what one can afford with access to prosperity. That's why the right praises strength and the left praises weakness, because societies can survive if their members are stronger, and when you have abundance, people being weaker, having more foreigners with which you don't share common values, gender equality, sexual liberation, and other luxury beliefs leftists have, are all things that you don't need to worry about. These are all things you can afford and indulge in. It also explains why the right abhors and the left adores revolution. Because for the right is the destruction of a society, and because for the left destroying can be done with zero consideration of whether you can build what you want next. Ironically, pretty soon you'll find out how true that is. The right is the builder of prosperity, the left is what you can afford to believe and the ways you can lie to yourself because you have prosperity just for the approval of your quasi-elite peers. They're the ways in which you can act as if you're above humanity because you don't have to pay the price needed to reach to your conditions of living. Oh, and by the way, bring the list back on screen. The reason why I didn't include communism or capitalism in that list is because they're both left-wing, but that's not a story for now. Given this, comes into discussion one of the biggest cultural issues to come in the public spotlight from the left in the past 20 years, the question of privilege. If you've listened to progressive circles, you've heard various notions of privilege being thrown around. White privilege, male privilege, able-bodied privilege, straight privilege. The left has taken for decades the approach that they are enlightened about these issues and everyone else needs to listen to their expertise and check their privilege. And if they don't want to give away their power, it's because in these unfairly advantaged groups, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. However, we've already seen what the left believes, what the left is oriented towards. It seeks the easy life. It is protected from the realities of the world in order to afford to have its beliefs. Yet, it still acts as if it's an authority on privilege and being disadvantaged. Leftist analysis stops at, we're going to get rid of the bad thing. It doesn't ever continue to ask, in the process of doing that, did we create some new problems that also need to be dismantled? That's because one of the most obvious qualities of the left, leftists, always project. Leftists are consistently more guilty of what they accuse the right of than the right is. Let's look at these privileges. White privilege. Is it the outcomes and conditions white people are born in? Born out of some discriminatory process? No. it happens because there's more of them. Any white privilege is a consequence of white majority. Representation? You turn on the TV and see mostly people who look like you because there are mostly people who look like you in the country. Values that whites are familiar with? Again, more white people exist to express their values, so the values of whites are more common. More politicians or upper management in companies are white? Again, there are more white people overall. White privilege, and often in fact things that are called white supremacy, are just due to white majority, with no discrimination taking place. Take for example a spokesperson of the German Greens party. She has a problem with white majority. Someone else? The most famous example is that of the Scottish Prime Minister Hamza Youssef.
The Lord President, white. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white. The Lord Advocate, white. The Solicitor General, white. The Chief Constable, white. Every Deputy Chief Constable, white. Every Assistant Chief Constable, white. The Head of the Law Society, white. The Head of the Faculty of Advocates, white. Every Prison Governor, white. And not just Justice. The Chief Medical Officer, white. The Chief Nursing Officer, white. The Chief Veterinary Officer, white. The Chief Social Work Advisor, white. Almost every trade union in this country headed by people who are white. In the Scottish Government, every Director General is white. Every chair of every public body is white. That is not good enough.
It is not always easy to find, but what you will see not infrequently is that people who have a problem with white supremacy actually have a problem with white majority. But maybe you want explicit leftists to ease into the idea.
To explain it, essentially there is a set of environmental factors that are in place in most white spaces and communities that seek to reproduce a passive engagement and adherence to white supremacy. Most white people in this country do not have close relationships with non-white people. The country is segregated in that way. And so what that means is you are learning and understanding about BIPOC experiences and realities through a white filter that is going to very much lend itself to negative interpretations of those things. And so what that gives us is that gives us colorblind racism, right? That makes it so when your uncle or your friend's dad starts doing racist shit, you don't see anything wrong with it. That's a normal thing that happens in your community, which means that when things are escalated and elevated to like more overtly racist shit, your resistance to that, even though you've been hearing your whole life, this whole thing that it's not a choice, is bullshit. Everybody who has participated in any type of conservative, racist, whatever activity knows you're not supposed to be racist. You do it anyway. Now, I get why you do it, because you're conditioned to do it, but this idea that you were just tricked into fucking posting swastikas on Twitter, you know, when you were 15 by some nefarious mind control from amazing atheists is bullshit.
The basis of what you are told here is because white people don't have close relationships with non-whites, which, of course, there is a lot fewer of them. Out of that, you were almost presented a picture of, because you don't have black supervision and approval of how you racially behave, you'll have racism normalized in your spaces. Or here's this: are whites just happy to be without the black people? Almost as if what else is supposed to calm this worry born out of racism will sprout when white people are among themselves. Ooh. Do you want other leftists? The best known example of low-key celebration by leftists of changing demographics is this.
When he points out that the number of electoral wards with a majority non-white population has increased from 119 in 2001 to 429 today. Similarly, he points out that in London, the white British population has decreased by 600,000, while the minority population has increased by 1.2 million. So yes, lads, we're winning.
Yeah, we're winning. Though, it can be that bad. It's not like anyone believes that the region being majority white is in itself racist. Oh, wait. Some people do think that. Great. But maybe they're indifferent about it. Let's see how a studio audience reacts to a decreasing white population.
Here's the results of the 2020 census just came out, and for the first time in American history, the number of white people went down.
I'll do anything. I'll be a good boy.
The hesitation, the confusion, the bewildered look, and, just for a fraction of a second, the deep and never seriously taken, off guard, primal reaction and self-assuring way of laughing it off. All to answer a simple question: should I be afraid? Though let's say, hypothetically, that there are no more white majority areas, will they stop talking about white privilege and white supremacy then? Oh. Okay then, we can apparently have white supremacy even without white majority. Fantastic. Okay, maybe white privilege is a bit of an exaggeration, but maybe at least whites are institutionally and systemically advantaged in white countries, right? Right?
This brings us on to number 4, the imported identity politics. This is a chart from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is the percentage of pupils taking the GCSEs in 2008 who went on to university at age 18 or 19 by ethnicity. So when you're in GCSEs, are general certificates of secondary education. They're basically like, when you graduate high school, you get GCSEs, right? And as you can see, when you split the British population up into different ethnicities, the Chinese, 75% likely to go on to university, Indian 67%, Black African 56%. But then right at the bottom of this is white British. The white British population, only 32% who in 2008 went on to university. 32%, right? So this is what a lot of people don't understand about the UK. The UK, despite what this chart says, the UK is not really a racially separated society. It's a class-separated society. And the vast majority of underclass and working class people are white British, simply due to demographics. And so underclass and working class people don't go on to university. And because the majority of them are white British, that's why this chart exists. And so, but taking this into consideration, let's say that we went on a scholarships hunt, right? So a scholarship, for those who don't know, is like you can get free money or you can get your tuition fee paid for people who are underprivileged or disadvantaged or not likely to go to university. You can get them paid. Well, according to this chart, you'd think that there would be a lot of scholarships for the white British, right? Because the white British are the least likely by far to go to university. Well, here's some scholarships that I found. We have an asylum seekers scholarship. So if you're an asylum seeker, you can get a scholarship there for the cost of tuition, which is pretty good. You can have a scholarship for asylum seekers again, or the children of asylum seekers. So you don't even have to be an asylum seeker. Your parents just have to be one. Okay, well, that's very generous. We have there is a preference for this scholarship to be awarded to someone who is a resident in the UK, okay, who is female. Oh, okay, well, that's unusual because females are more likely than males to go to university, but besides the point. And from a BAME background, which I believe stands for Black, Asian, and Middle Eastern. Okay, well, that's unusual because again, the white British population, specifically the white male population, is the least likely demographic to go to university, so a bit unusual for the scholarship to cater to other demographics that are the opposite. And what is this? You must meet the following criteria to be considered for this scholarship. Identify as belonging to one of the following ethnic groups: Black or Black British, Caribbean, Black or Black British, African. Okay, so basically you're not white British, basically. What I found was when I was going on a scholarship hunt is there is not a single scholarship anywhere in the UK that could be found to be aimed at white British students in particular. None. Zero. Despite the fact that, as we've just seen, the white British population is the least likely to go to university. The least likely. So why is this the case, right? Like, why is this the case? Well, what if there was someone who wanted to start a white male student scholarship? Well, have a look. Private schools reject philanthropists' $1 million scholarship gift intended for disadvantaged white male students. Dulwich College and Winchester College reportedly turned down gifts amounting to over $1.2 million over fears of breaching anti-discrimination laws. 2 leading private schools have reportedly turned down the offer of more than £1 million to pay the fees for disadvantaged white students. Both Dulwich College and Winchester College rejected Professor Sir Brian Thwaite's scholarship proposals, fearing the move would put them in breach of anti-discrimination laws, according to The Times. The 96-year-old, who attended both schools on scholarships, had intended to leave money in his will for white British boys from poor backgrounds because they are the least likely demographic to go to university. Studies have shown that disadvantaged white children perform worse at school than almost every other ethnic group. A 2017 study carried out by the Government Social Mobility Commission found that only 10% of the poorest white students attended university, compared with 30% of black children and 50% from Bangladeshi communities. Despite the apparent educational disparity, Dulwich turned down the gift of £400,000 in Sir Brian's will, and Winchester rejected £800,000 according to the newspaper. A spokeswoman for the Winchester College said that acceptance of a bequest of this nature would be neither in the interests of the school as a charity, nor the specific interests of those it aims to support through its work. She added, notwithstanding the legal exceptions to relevant legislation, the school does not see how discrimination on grounds of a boy's colour could ever be compatible with its values. Sir Brian drew a comparison between his offer to the scholarships at Cambridge University for black students created by grime artist Stormzy. If Cambridge University can accept a much larger donation in support of black students, why cannot I do the same for underprivileged white British, Sir Brian said. And that's a good question. Right, so if it would be against anti-discrimination laws to provide a scholarship specifically for white male students, why is it, as we've just seen in the scholarship hunt that I went through, there are scholarships for asylum seekers, children of asylum seekers, non-white populations, women. Why is it that only the white British, or specifically the white British male population, cannot have scholarships? And the simple answer is because the UK has ignored its class problems and is willingly imported American identity politics in its place. This is a photo of the current British Prime Minister and the current British Deputy Prime Minister, Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, before they became the government. And this was taken back in 2020, I believe, during the BLM protests. And as you can see, they're kneeling down. And they're kneeling down over the death of George Floyd back in 2020, which I'm sure everyone knows about. Now, here's the thing. George Floyd's death took place in another country, in another continent, and had absolutely nothing to do with the British police or the British state whatsoever. In fact, it had nothing to do with this country or anything to do with this state. And despite that fact, here are senior, powerful British politicians kneeling down to what is essentially an American problem. An American, in America, it may be true that there's a lot of race polarization, a lot of problems with race in America and race and justice, etc. But this is not the case in the UK. This is the reality. This is our politicians. This is the reality. And this is our politicians. The UK is not some sort of hyper. I mean, there are racism, against non-white populations in the UK, obviously, but the UK has institutional racism against the white British population because, as I described, the UK has a problem with class.
Oh, how quaint. But surely, at least whites are more racist, correct? Nope. Not even that. Turns out that white people have the most consistent opinion about other races, while every other race sees whites as the worst and themselves as the best. And white people are the only race which has a section of them without group preference, meaning that everyone else except whites always prefers themselves more than other races, but whites sometimes prefer people of other races above their own. Remember what I said a couple of minutes ago, that leftists are consistently more guilty of what they accuse the right of than the right is? We've seen what attitude the supposed fight against racism takes. Tell me, was white racism ever this hostile towards non-whites as anti-racism is hostile towards whites? White racism has at best been a combination of violence against criminals for people that some agitators convinced the rest of a mob that they were criminals, or the belief and institutions that insisted that other races should be ruled. But this is, we will celebrate your decline, you must devote yourself to our interests. Even when your culture was replaced with ours, we'll still be on the watch so that you can't gain power. So that's white privilege down. Let's take another privilege. Male privilege. Wonderful. What is male privilege about? Well, it's about assumed competence and accumulated power. So let's examine this for a bit. Let's grant that men do have more power on average than women. Okay, so what are they supposed to do with this power? Lo and behold, they're supposed to use it for the benefit of women. To offer gifts, provision, protection. So, when men have more power than women, women still benefit from that power. Do women have any such obligations? No, not really. When women have more power or more wealth than men, they're doing it, and there are no objections for them doing it for their own sake. So, men's excess in power and resources are for the benefit of women, and women's excess in power and resources are also made for the benefit of women. Okay, let's say this isn't a big deal. Do women have the expectation that men have a certain level of power and resources? Turns out they do. There can be economically unattractive men when the men don't match the woman's lifestyle standard. Do men have such an attitude towards women? No, not really. The only way for a woman to be economically unattractive to the average man is for her to be in some significant debt that he will have to pay off. Something else? Yes. There are also women who have a personal problem with dating men who are not at the same educational level as they are. So, a woman with a bachelor's degree will likely want to date a man with a master's. A woman with a master's will want to date a PhD. A PhD, well, there isn't much higher but another PhD. It may be possible for a woman to date at a lower educational level, but that's something that she has to come to a realization of, approaching it as a last resort. Women, it's been repeatedly demonstrated, want to date up, and men don't have nearly the same expectations for women. So we've looked at when men having power, but what happens when men don't have power? Well, if men don't have power, culturally they are told they're supposed to get themselves out of it. When a woman has troubles, she can be fairly confident in the possibility that she can ask and receive the help of men, but this is not something that men can ask of women. In general, charities for women receive more funds from both men and from women than charities for men. And I couldn't find any sources on this in time, but mixed-sex charities also receive less funding than women's only. Then in general, continuing to look at unsuccessful men, there are more homeless men than women, and they tend to stay homeless for more time and have also additional problems like drug and alcohol dependence or mental illness. Another gender-based phenomenon one could observe is that when there are more men than women negatively affected by something, then the priority is still solving the problem for women. The most blatant example of this I found on the page for UN Women, and it said that 11% of killed journalists were women, and the campaign was to stop targeting women journalists. Men are targeted 8 times more, but still, women need more advocacy. In addition to this, in terms of biases of how to speak about the sexes, it is generally more accepted to speak more things positive of women or more things negative of men. When women are criticized, the critics will readily be accused of misogyny, even if it has nothing to do with them. And when men are praised, there will be dissenting voices claiming they don't need the praise. The true nature of men's privilege is revealed from this attitude towards unsuccessful men. Men's success, as far as society is concerned, is a requirement it places on men. Women are not interested in men who are not successful, and society wants to help men less than it wants to help women. On top of that, society is usually reluctant to praise men. Men are usually invisible until something goes wrong, so a man has to fix it. In other words, male privilege is the notion that men are either successful or they're not human. That may seem extreme to you, or conversely, you may claim that this standard and this treatment of unsuccessful men is
part of patriarchy. It's part of patriarchy. Part of patriarchy. I don't know if you're noticing a theme. Patriarchy. Feminists hate patriarchy. We do not hate you.
part of patriarchy. Okay, I got it. But if that were true, if the demand for success was done by the patriarchy, that would mean that abolishing patriarchy would also get rid of this demand, which we could tell happened because women's standards for men would lower. Oh, wait. That isn't happening and is never going to happen. Feminists themselves are already pressuring men to be better anyway. Things like this show that women don't want to be equal to men, they want men who are better than them. Now, this is perfectly fine, but if you want to sustain this dynamic, if women want their boyfriends and husbands to lift them up with their manhood, it means that when we improve the levels of success for women, we need to improve the levels of success for men more than that. And going back to the notion that leftists are consistently more guilty of what they accuse the right of than the right is,
it's simply that men are, by nature of being men, naturally seeking out those positions and do them better because of their natural provider vibes. You see this logic applied each and every time some dickhead claims the wage gap doesn't exist and that women simply choose jobs which pay less. No thought is given as to why women choose those positions or why those positions are paid less. That's just what women do naturally because of their girl brains, which naturally don't want as much money as men. It's kind of silly, right? Because of course there's no biological drive within men that makes them need to provide. It's the result of patriarchal conditioning, the justifying logic of patriarchy, of maintaining male privilege, backfiring and making men sad because the thing it is justifying actually sucks. It sucks for everybody.
That all happened recently. Oh my god, the privileged life these poor little boys must have, that their biggest problem is being lonely, i.e. so insufferable that nobody wants to sleep with them. So much more pressing than the poor distribution of wealth causing people to suffer food and housing insecurity. Boo-hoo, you're lonely and have no friends and are suicidal when? Because feeling alienated under capitalism apparently isn't a thing. And why would a struggling man even want to move left when the left appears actively hostile to them?
The question of whether or not the hashtag online left does enough to appeal to hashtag men has become the question du jour. And men have most of the money, authority, and do most of the murdering and assaulting.
The average young man in America isn't Jeff Bezos. Also, why did this motherfucker just FBI crime statistics at me? Men do the most murder. Okay?
They like having all of the stuff they don't deserve. They like that. They want it to stay that way because it suits them. Because of the stuff, telling people they're special and deserve all the nice shit that they have, that's going to be an easier sell 10 times out of 10 than saying, hey, maybe you should have less stuff and other people should have more.
Leftism is when you don't have a lot of stuff. We're gonna take your stuff. You sound like a 65-year-old Fox News boomer's idea of what the left is. Are you a CIA agent? The right is saying to men, you will own a house. You will have beautiful children with your loving wife. You will have privacy. You will have free speech. You will own things, and you will be happy. And the left is like,
they like having all of the stuff they don't deserve.
The left accuses men of being too successful, but at the same time, it demands of them to be successful, and they don't deserve it once they are. Alright. Really endearing? Oh, and not to mention that under feminism, the most hated movement or idea is not anti-feminism, which is what you'd expect. No. Feminists hate men's rights more than they do anti-feminism. They use men's rights as a pejorative they associate with everything they don't like. I mean, look at this. You have to be a few screws loose to believe in this progression. Let's go for another type of privilege. Straight privilege. Well, society needs more people to keep existing, and more people are made by straight relations. So of course that straight relations will be seen more positively and straight marriages will be seen as more valid. Other privileges? Able-bodied privilege. Well, society couldn't exist as it is without people able to build it as it is. If most people had a limitation, they would build society around that limitation. If most people don't, they will need to exercise special effort into elevating the living standards of people with those limitations. Thin privilege. You literally remain thin if you don't eat in excess. Cis privilege. For example, cis people having more easy access to some medical procedures. I will address this in a future chapter, I have something prepared for that. What about rich privilege? This is surely something that leftists would have a point on. Yeah, leftists, there's a phenomenon that I'm sure you know of, called champagne socialists or Prosecco communists, meaning that usually a lot of the figures pushing really hard for leftism are very rich themselves. Take the Carlos Maza controversy, where it was discovered that his parents were millionaires. Or Hassan Piker's controversy of buying a $2.7 million mansion. Or many leftist figures with Patreon numbers in the thousands and sometimes tens of thousands. Usually, right-wing creators only become big figures if they already had connections from outside forces, but leftists have a much easier time growing because they say fashionable ideas that make people feel good about themselves while blaming their problems on the millionaires and billionaires until they become millionaires themselves. That's what I had to say about privilege. Though, before we're done, let's look at one more thing to say about leftists always project. Their attitude politically. Let's have a look at just a little bit of Trump derangement syndrome.
I want to start this delicious meal of fake news with the dessert first. I want to start it with that little cherry on top of the chocolate sundae. I want to start it with CNN, where CNN's Don Lemon decided to skip over all of the actual news and have a breakdown, an on-air hysterical breakdown, because President Trump's campaign team tweeted out a meme.
In addition to all the lies and all the blustering at tonight's rally, Trump's war room posted a meme on Twitter today showing Trump as the supervillain Thanos from the Marvel Avengers movies, dispatching his Democratic enemies. Take a look at this.
I am inevitable.
On this solemn day, I recall that the first order of business for members of
What are we in junior high school? Like, what the hell? What is this? Like what? What? I cannot believe that I'm even having to report this on the news. This is crazy. This is literally crazy. Are you people insane?
It goes on. It in some ways it even gets better. The key takeaway though here for me is that Don Lemon and CNN and the mainstream media overall are always projecting. They call Trump a liar, they lie more than Trump. They say that Trump is behaving in an immature manner. They behave in a much more immature manner. They say Trump is vulgar, they're more vulgar. I mean, he says, what are we? What are we, in middle school? What the hell? What is this crap? He says crap later on in the year. What is, he stumbles, he's silent, he's befuddled, he says like. What is this like what is... Yeah, you are behaving like you're in junior high school, Don Lemon. He says in there, he says, I can't believe I actually have to cover this. You don't have to cover it. This is not news. This is a Twitter account run by one of the Trump campaign officials tweeting out a funny meme on the internet, which is made for memes. That's not news. You don't have to cover that at all. You're choosing to cover that because you're a fake news organization. So you don't want to cover the good jobs numbers. You don't want to cover the devastating Horowitz testimony. The Nets didn't even cover the Horowitz testimony. They've been streaming the ridiculous impeachment testimony, back-to-back, wall-to-wall coverage for weeks now, and then the devastating Horowitz testimony on the abuses in the FBI and the DOJ, well, that one they can't cover. They don't have time. They've got to cover memes on Twitter instead.
Okay, I need a break. I expected chapter 1.2 to be divided into 2 parts, but I need to take a break here. It's Tuesday, I cannot possibly edit the remaining section until Friday and both take care of my duties and have a new video ready next week. So Basics in Political Literacy will be 3 parts long.
I'm not crazy! You're crazy! Especially you, Nappa! Hey!
This is already the longest video I ever made and the one where I did the largest amount of new editing techniques for. I hope you understand. Also, because of my initial planning, the donor-exclusive segment for part 1 is now in part 2, so this video doesn't have any donor-exclusive segments. If I had planned any to be donor-exclusive, it would have been the one on trends. I would have made it longer and maybe rearranged it to include the parts about leftists supporting a cause until it applies to them and they have to reflect on it. Anyway, that's all I have for part 1. Time to start editing part 2. This is just to give you an example of the kind of boost in experience that donor exclusive segments will give. Of course, I currently don't have any donors. When I will have more elaborated donor exclusive segments and even exclusive topics planned. See you in hopefully another week. Coming up next, I will teach you about the draining process. And there's a reason why I had to cut off things where I did. You'll see. You'll see.
Fight for our children! Our children's children, so they will not carry these marks!